News drives markets, and every day, Montel's experienced reporters are on top of the stories that shape European market developments. Can you afford to miss out? Go to montelnews.com for the latest price-driving stories and a free trial.
Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. Across Europe, energy, or more specifically, the cost of energy has hit headlines, with media calling the situation a crisis and focusing, perhaps rightly so, on the increased costs for households and the vulnerable in society. There are a number of fundamental reasons that explain the high prices: geopolitics, low wind, weak gas storage, interconnector outages. But politicians in several countries have questioned the working of the internal energy market, with France's finance minister in particular, Bruno Le Maire, calling it obsolete. In today's pod, we discuss the consequences of the soaring prices on the continent's electricity-intensive industry and ask what, if anything, can be done to mitigate the impact. And also whether these high prices will spur some sectors into signing renewable power purchase agreements, or PPAs. My name is Richard Sverrisson, and I have the great pleasure of being joined today by several prominent experts from Europe's non-ferrous metals industry. Alexander Arnesen of Norway's Elkem, a silicon and ferro alloys producer. A warm welcome to you.
Thanks a lot, Richard. It's great to be on the show. After having listened to many of your excellent podcasts, it's great to be here finally.
Well, thank you, Alexander. We'll try and get you back on as well. And then there's Nick Keramidas of Greece's Mytilineos, I hope I pronounced that correctly, an aluminium producer. So hello to you, Nick.
Hello, Richard. Thanks for having me. Indeed, you pronounce it perfectly, and this is a remarkable achievement, actually, given the Greek name. But again, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Excellent. And finally, Cillian O'Donoghue, who's Energy and Climate Change Director at Eurometaux, the European Metals Association. Welcome to the pod, Cillian.
Thanks, Richard, and very good to be here.
So I'd like to start off, guys, by talking about the soaring prices of electricity, also gas, but more specifically electricity. What's been the impact on industry, and what will be the consequences if prices stay high for a prolonged period? Cillian, if I can start off with you here.
Yeah, I guess, well, to begin, I would say it's really hitting us. We've seen a massive increase in the price. So, if you were buying for €40 megawatt hour this time last year, you're paying 160 or higher in many member states. And if there's one sector which is very exposed to high electricity prices, is non-ferrous metals. As we know, we're the most electro-intensive of sectors. So by 40% of your cost is electricity. So if anybody is exposed, it's us. The impact has been, I would say, quite severe. We've seen quite a lot of curtailments, and we don't know yet about closures, but we've seen quite a lot. Some of these things I can't go into in as much detail as I would like for confidentiality reasons. But I think from the media, you can see kind of who's curtailed production and also who is under serious trouble. If I can, a couple of things I would add would be that the impacts have been mitigated somewhat for a couple of reasons. I think the first is obviously lots of companies hedge. So the short-term impact of the power price increase maybe doesn't always impact as much given this. The second thing is prices of metals, in particularly aluminium, are very high at the moment. So at the London Metal Exchange, we have a good price of aluminium, which makes things a little bit easier. And just the final thing I would say is it's hard if you are losing money in your production, it's very hard to close on the short term. The ramping down and ramping up costs are very high. So we tend to continue producing. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of the short-term impacts. And I think Nick can complement.
Right. Thanks, Cillian. What I would like to add is that as far as the aluminium industry is concerned, obviously we do have currently quite high prices. But one thing that needs to be flagged is that these sectors are price takers. So basically, you don't pass on increased electricity prices to consumers. You can't. There is zero elasticity, so to speak. So basically, if we had seen this perfect storm at low prices, at the low cycle of the LME, for instance, then we would be discussing massive shutdowns in the European industry, even despite hedging strategies, because inevitably the aluminium industry has to have visibility as far as the electricity pricing is concerned for a longer periods of time. And this, well, I wouldn't say it seems to be easing out anytime soon. So I think the risk is still there.
Alexander, if I can bring you in here as well, I mean, it's very high price in Europe, but it's more of a global phenomenon as well. I mean, they're high in Asia and America. What can you say about the exposure of European companies here in this global context?
It's a good question. And also, as Nick said, our industry, it's a price taker industry. The price of metals that's set on a global stage that applies to aluminium and also all kinds of other metals as well. So the important point for our industry is to remain competitive on a global scale. And the surge in power prices that we have seen over the last couple of weeks and the last few months actually applies in principle to all countries, but in practice it applies mostly to Europe. And the reason for that is that we have a liberalized power market in Europe. Industry hedge power, they do that at market prices, whilst industry in other countries are mostly paying a regulated tariff. It's a tariff that's decided by either national or local authorities. So they're not exposed to the same kind of price surge that we have seen recently in Europe. And that's a worry for the long term, because as I said, at some point, the long-term PPAs, they have to be renewed at some point in time, and then we're exposed to the much higher market prices in Europe as compared to our competitors globally.
We'll return to that discussion a bit later, but if I can stick with you, the market conditions, as Cillian mentioned as well, are vastly different from what they were a year ago. Have some companies and sectors hedge their exposure better than others, Alexander?
Yeah, I think what you generally see, or in my experience, it's mostly larger companies, more power-intensive companies. They tend to have a more well-developed hedging program, so they tend to hedge longer out on the curve, signing typically PPAs for 5, 10, 15 years, something like that. Whilst smaller companies, they tend to have, I would call it the less sophisticated hedging strategy. They hedge for a much shorter period of time. Sometimes they're fully exposed in the spot markets. And those companies are also, they usually have a smaller balance, meaning that they're more financially vulnerable. So they're the companies that are running a much higher risk, especially in the short term.
You know, although it's a different sector, we've seen certainly with the power supplies in the UK, people are talking of massive amounts of bankruptcies, and maybe the same could apply to SMEs should this continue. Nick, have you got something to add here about the small and medium-sized enterprises?
Right. Well, as far as large enterprises are concerned, the ones that do hedge, I mean, this is not necessarily a strategy that's, let's say an attack strategy. It's rather a defensive strategy. I think that once one realizes the exposure, the actual exposure of a primary aluminium producer to electricity prices, then you realize that buying electricity to a large share of your electricity at the spot market is absolutely a no-go. So basically, quoting a study by the German EWI, if, for instance, your power price increases by 10 euros, that devours roughly 25% of your GVA. So basically, you cannot possibly sit back and enjoy the ride and just, expose your production costs to fluctuations in the market. However, that said, this hedging is not, tantamount to immunity, let's say, to wholesale prices. Part of the electricity is regularly procured in spot markets or, for optimization reasons and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that large energy-intensive industries are completely immune. Definitely agreeing with Alex also that long-term contracts are not, let's say, panacea. It's something that, lasts, but not forever. So basically, you should expect that these will eventually, the duration will phase out, and you would have to face the actual conditions in the wholesale markets again.
I mentioned in my intro some calls for politicians, calls for intervention in the market as it is at the moment. We've seen noises from France, from Spain. Cillian, if I can bring you in here, what can or should be done to shield industry from these extreme price surges?
So I think there's two levels where there could be potential action. First is the European level, and the second is the member state level. I think most of the real concrete actions can be done at member state level, but at the same time, we would like to see, and we've written to the European Commission a public letter, some action at the European level. And I think some things the European Commission can do, and let's not forget, they are the ones who set the whole kind of architecture of the energy and climate framework. Some things they could do, we had kind of 5 policy requests in our letter. I think the first thing we'd like to see is we think the Commission should monitor, particularly the gas market shortages this winter. We hope that won't happen, but that's something where we think the Commission should look closely. The second thing is the carbon price. The EU ETS price is very high at the moment. It's over €6 a ton. I know from some people's perspective, that is what we should be aiming for. But looking ahead, we see that as potentially getting higher. So I think we should have some mechanism to ensure that the ETS price doesn't go kind of out of control. And without getting too technical, we think the market stability reserve or potential other mechanisms could maybe limit the price spikes. Kind of also a few other things we think the Commission could do would be the most important thing in this whole decarbonization process is kind of the availability of carbon-free electricity at globally competitive prices. It's something Alex and Nick also spoke about. And that's such an important enabler of the transition that we think the Commission should be doing more to ensure that happens. Also, and Nick can elaborate in more detail, but the idea of kind of carbon-free PPAs, the Commission probably needs to be more flexible, working with member states to ensure that we can sign these PPAs outside of the Nordic market. They're kind of the main things we would say. And the final thing is just, I think the Commission needs to be more flexible in terms of state aid rules, because looking ahead to climate neutrality by 2050, it's not a straight road. There's going to be a lot of bumps on the path. And we'll need interventions from member states, particularly like we're seeing now with price spikes. I think more flexible state aid rules, which will allow member states like Spain, France, which we've seen in recent weeks, to kind of intervene, to kind of give some relief to industry. I think we're going to need more of that going forward. So there are kind of a few things we would see. I think my colleagues can elaborate a bit more at the member state level.
This would be relief in terms of the tax the tariffs, the levies outside the pure energy costs, for example.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, I think with electricity, you always have to break it into the energy component and the regulatory components. And sometimes the regulatory components can be huge impact on the overall price. And in particular, from our side, there is the ETS, indirect carbon costs, which is basically the ETS cost is passed on to us via higher electricity prices. And you have a system of kind of indirect compensation across Europe that is not implemented in every member state. So we think the Commission should be encouraging member states to provide compensation there. And we think member states should give that compensation. That's just one example. There's quite a few things where the Commission work with member states could intervene.
That's very interesting. So now, Alexander, would you like to add something to the discussion around measures that can be taken to shield industry in such a high price environment? I
think, well, first of all, I do support what Cillian just said, especially about the so-called CO2 compensation. It's crucial for power-intensive industry in Europe competing on a global stage. I think it's interesting in this discussion that's been in the media of price intervention in the markets. It mainly at this stage it seems to mainly focus on end consumers, households, and so on. What's not been discussed so far is that is just a cure for the symptoms. It's a cure for the high prices, and it's not really a cure for the underlying problem, which is a lack of energy. There's a shortage of gas. There's a shortage of renewable energy in the system, and that's what's causing the prices to surge. So just relieving consumers of energy taxes and so on, while it's a noble act for sure, it doesn't really solve the underlying problem, which is an energy shortage, and that's the thing that really has to be addressed.
Nick, anything to add to this?
Yes, thanks. Building on what Cillian and Alex just mentioned, I mean, there's the short-term and the long-term perspective in this exercise. When it comes to the short-term, I would actually align with Euroelectric on this, who suggest that interventions, as far as taxes are concerned and stuff like that, can actually be a good patch right now, including our proposal for rerouting CO2 revenues. That's the proposal of the Greek government, actually rerouting part of the CO2 revenues to relieve consumers. And by that, I would flag what Alex already mentioned, that the consumers are not just households, but industry as well, from the price surge. But that said, as far as the long term is concerned, I think what we need to focus on is, holding a solid and robust discussion on giving access to competitively priced green electricity, particularly for the electro-intensive industry, through schemes that boost RES PPAs. In the long run, this, we believe, is a recipe for success. Spain's reaction, for instance, to this debacle right now, I would actually say it's not really advisable. By that, I mean structural changes to the long-term electricity market design under this panic situation are not the best way for policy making. I think this requires solid discussion surrounding the market design and things like that, and this needs to happen, well, in a sane environment rather than as a reaction to current price surges.
Absolutely, that would be a knee-jerk reaction, and those are rarely very effective. Cillian, you mentioned the letter that you'd sent to the Commission. Do you feel that the Commission is listening to the industry concerns?
Yeah, well, I think in fairness to the Commission, they have reacted and they say they're going to come with a communication, a strategy on the 4th of October, which is relatively soon. I think the Commission by nature are very good at setting overall frameworks. I think that's where they're very strong. In terms of reacting to short-term developments, they are much more kind of slower paced than a member state. The one exception would maybe be, when the COVID crisis first hit, they kind of really loosened the state aid rules and allowed member states to intervene. But I think that's the exception to the rule. I think the Commission is generally slow to react to kind of emergency developments. So we'll have to see what will be in this strategy. And also we'll have to see how much focus is on industry, because there's two sides to this kind of emergency. Is the consumer households who are really getting hit, but also there's the very electro-intensive industry who's been hit very hard. So we are discussing with the Commission and with other energy intensives. We've sent some input. I think the industries which have been most hit is non-ferrous metals. And then I think the fertilizers industry has been hit very hard as well. So we'll have to see what's in the strategy, and we'll have to see how much of what we recommend they integrate in the upcoming strategy. If I can, kind of more broadly speaking and looking ahead, the Commission has a very clear strategy of climate neutrality by 2050. And as part of that, I think it's very important that electricity prices stay in check. I'm simplifying here, but kind of looking ahead to 2050, we kind of need two revolutions. We need industry to electrify as much as possible, and we need power to decarbonize. And if power doesn't decarbonize, or if power becomes too expensive in the decarbonization process, it's going to have major implications in that it would be a big disincentive for other industries like steel, chemicals, to follow the non-ferrous metals lead and to electrify their processes. So I think the Commission needs to be careful that if electricity prices become too expensive, then the whole kind of 2050 agenda and the whole electrification for decarbonization agenda kind of very much gets sidetracked.
One intervention that Elkem has put forward here, if I understand correctly, Alexander, is you've suggested limiting power exports from Norway in situations of such high prices. Could you expand on this and explain why this wouldn't be a breach of internal market rules?
Yeah, it's the kind of statements that are sure to make headlines, especially in Norway. Let me just underline the fact that we fully support power exchange between countries. That includes export, of course. It's of great benefit to both countries that exchange power, especially when you connect power systems that are different, like a weather-based power system like we have in Norway with countries around us that have a larger degree of thermal energy. So again, power exchange, it's a good thing. It's of a mutual benefit. But what we are concerned about now is the power balance in Norway. And it's a long-term issue and it's a short-term issue. And long-term, we have to make sure that the new power production keeps up with the new consumption. There are a lot of initiatives in Norway going on these days with new industries that are planning to come online, and a lot of them are going to consume a lot of electricity. So if we're going to realize that, and if that's going to happen, then we need to make sure that the production side keeps up. Because if not, then power prices are going to spiral out of control. And as Cillian mentioned, the key to the green transition is to have plentiful and cheap green electricity. So I think that's important. And the other thing that we're worried about is, of course, right now, the power balance short term. So we have a situation where we have low reservoir fillings in Norway, record low in southern Norway. And in that situation, we keep exporting power out of the country. And we'll start exporting even more today with a new cable to the UK. So there's power flowing out. It seems that the regulatory authorities think that as long as we have interconnectors with other countries, we're not going to have a problem, because if we have a shortage in Norway, we can just reverse the flow and start importing from those countries. But what we are worried about is the fact that those countries now also have weather-based power systems. And the weather is the same in all countries around the North Sea basin. So when it's cold and no wind and dry in Norway, there's also no wind in UK and also not in Germany. So it might be that they will simply not have any power to send to us when we sit here in February with with empty reservoirs. So that's the situation we're worried about.
Just referring to the power cable, we're recording on Thursday morning when the North Sea Link was set in commercial operation, and with some analysts expecting almost 10 terawatt hours of exports over the winter. So maybe that could add to the tight balance there. I want to move the discussion onto renewable power purchase agreements. We're in this very, very high price scenario. Are they spurring a drive to PPAs or a drive to decarbonize? What do you think here, Cillian?
Yeah, well, I think about PPAs, I think the first thing to say is, as a sector, we always have a preference for kind of, as Alex said, medium, long-term PPAs. It's, the electricity is 40% of the cost, so we like to kind of lock that in. When we speak, I think it's important to distinguish between renewable PPAs also and kind of carbon-free PPAs. So renewable PPAs, what we generally mean is maybe wind and solar, and carbon-free, you include hydro and nuclear. So that's kind of, I know it's terminology we're going through here, but it's an important distinction. So what we see is the Commission strategy for 2050 says we'll have 85% wind and solar by 2045. So 85. So it's a huge number. So that's a revolution in the electricity market. Looking ahead as industry, we obviously have to adapt, and we have to say, okay, if this is the way the European electricity market is going to go, and we're base load consumers, so your aluminum smelter produces 24/7, 365 days a year. We're base load consumers. We need to find a solution between the kind of intermittent renewables and the base load consumers. So that's kind of what we're looking into, and kind of various companies are trying to find solutions. What I would say is it's somewhat mixed success. I think in the Nordics, we are seeing kind of big long-term PPAs with wind power. So kind of projects in Sweden and Norway. But obviously in Norway and Sweden, you have kind of good market conditions. And in particular, the hydro can act as a battery. However, we do see challenges beyond the Nordic market. And we're trying to find solutions there. Nick's company, Mytilineos, are looking into kind of trying to sign renewable PPAs as well. And he can maybe elaborate a bit on what they're doing in Greece. But what I would say is finding a solution between the baseload, real electro-intensive, and the intermittent wind and solar. That's going to be a major challenge going forward. And I think we definitely need the member states and the Commission working together to try and find some solutions here.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, we're talking about PPAs for the electricity intensive industry here, because PPAs, corporate PPAs are booming in some parts of Europe and the globe even. But Nick, could you elaborate on a solution that people are looking at in Greece?
Sure. First things first, I'd like to say that indeed, as you rightly mentioned, Richard, there is a sort of a boom in terms of the PPAs signed throughout the globe. But when you look at the figures, the actual figures, for instance, in Europe, we're looking at roughly 10 gigawatts of corporate PPAs having been signed. So the number, despite all the publicity surrounding it, is not huge. It's not something really considerable. So we need to identify the barriers, and we need to look at the economics of REST PPAs as well. So there is a sort of a misconception out there that, for instance, REST PPAs will provide a cheap, stable price for electro-intensives in the long run, immune, let's say, of carbon cost and so on and so forth. Actually, the reality is that REST PPAs for mature technologies that have achieved what we refer to as market parity actually reflect market prices. So basically, you can't just go to a REST developer and ask for a strike price at the REST PPA that's completely irrelevant to market prices. They expect to either sell the electricity to the industry under a long-term contract or sell it on the market. So basically, what you see is sort sort of a price that more or less reflects market prices as well. That said, one of the huge challenges faced by the electro-intensive industries has to do with this mismatch, as Cillian rightly mentioned, in terms of the profile. So we've got stochastic generation on the one hand, and you got baseload 24/7 operation on the other hand. So what Greece is trying to do right now, and if my intelligence is correct, they're right now in the process of communicating this proposal to the Commission for approval, is establishing, so to speak, a green pool. That is to say, a sort of a virtual pool where electricity will be aggregated by RES produced and financed through corporate PPAs by electro-intensives. And the shaping part of the cost, this firming and shaping part of the cost, will be to some extent compensated by state funds, well, CO2 revenues, basically. So this will allow the electro-intensives, on the one hand, to come forward and finance the addition of new renewables capacity on merchant terms to the system, while at the same time mitigating part of the risk that has to do with the shaping exercise, which is a huge problem. And, having looked at the figures and the reality in most of continental Europe, it's one of the key barriers that have prevented electro-intensives from coming forward and signing those PPAs.
For those listeners who may be unfamiliar with the term RES, that's renewable energy sources, an abbreviation. But absolutely, Nick, that sounds a very, very interesting idea. I think it'd be interesting to see how much traction that gets in the Commission and the EU executive. We're running a bit out of time, gentlemen, but I'd like to sort of round off with a discussion about the guarantees of origin. Now, I think, this is a tool used to verify and certify that production of renewable energy is actually green. But I know industry has some strong feelings in this matter. Could I ask you, Cillian, to explain why you're quite skeptical of the guarantees of origin market?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is what we want is a good system to certify Scope 2 emissions. I think we all agree we need that. The guarantees of origin system, the way it's been implemented and the way it works now, in reality, it leads to a lot of greenwashing. If I give a very simple example, if you look at Iceland, there's no interconnectors, as we all know, but there's part of the European market. The producers there can obviously sell their guarantees of origin to, let's say, Poland. And what happens then, if you use that as the accounting system, then you can say that the aluminium produced in Iceland is not green because the guarantees of origin have been sold. So that's just giving one example which shows kind of perverse impacts. We want a solution on Scope 2 kind of certification, and we do see major weaknesses in the guarantees of origin system. What we can replace it with and what the best way to certify Scope 2, we don't yet have a simple solution. I think we need something, but if I'm being very honest, we don't have one simple solution on the table today.
Cillian, could you just explain what Scope 2 emissions are for those listeners who are unfamiliar with that term?
Sorry, yes, of course. So you have basically Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And I'll focus on Scope 1 and 2. Scope 1 is your direct emissions, so on your plant. Scope 2 is your electricity, so all the electricity you consume. That's what you call your indirect emissions, Scope 2 emissions. And for a very electro-intensive sector like non-ferrous metals, Scope 2 emissions are much greater than Scope 1. So for aluminium, they can be sometimes up to 6 times greater, can be your Scope 2 emissions compared to your Scope 1.
Thank you. Have you got something to add here, Alexander, particularly the views of industry about guarantees of origin and how you can safeguard against the kind of greenwashing that Cillian mentioned?
So we are not really big proponents of the guarantee of origin system. Elkem as a company, we seek to have our industrial production in countries where there is renewable power available. So that's in Norway, Iceland, South America, Malaysia, and so on. We think that's the most appropriate method to track the Scope 2 emissions. And it's also the only way you can do it on a global scale, because the guarantee of origin system applies to Europe only. But to the degree that we will use the guarantee of origin system, or that European industry will use it, I think it's important to link the guarantees of origin with the actual physical power consumption as closely as possible, geographically and also in time. I think that will lend more legitimacy to the system as such.
So you would support moves to create 24/7 tracking system for renewable energy?
Well, I won't support too much that has to do with guarantees of origin. But if it's one way to improve the system, that's the case.
I mean, Joe, the proponents of guarantees of origin would say that a megawatt of green energy is better than no megawatt of energy, But Nick, would you have anything to add here to this discussion?
Well, what is important looking forward and taking into consideration the Fit for 55 targets is to ensure additionality, basically. And this is exactly what the proposal you mentioned earlier, the Green Pool proposal, is seeking to ensure. So adding new capacity to the system and reflecting that electricity that's being added to the system in the PPAs. Hence, whether it's going to be a geo-based system that provides this certification for the renewable electricity produced and backed by the PPA or not, that is less important. The issue is, let's say, a bundled system of guarantees of origin, wherein you can actually trace the electricity, that's where it's being produced and where it's being consumed. So I think that what Cillian rightly mentioned already from the get-go is absolutely valid, that the way the geo system has been implemented in Europe has led to considerable greenwashing, and we're not big fans of greenwashing. So we don't think that's going to contribute to actually meeting the targets.
Gentlemen, thank you ever so much for a fascinating discussion on how industry views this high price environment and some of the concerns you have, or many of the concerns you have, but also some of the solutions you've put forward to mitigate the exposure that you have to these high prices, because you're in a very important part of European industry. So thanks once again, gentlemen.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks, Montel.
Thanks a million.
So listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.